A hallway. Not a stage. Not a soundstage floor dressed with props and arc lights. Just a narrow corridor in the back of the Paramount lot. Late afternoon. The kind of October light that makes everything look like it's already a memory. The year is 1958. Two men stand 8 feet apart. One of them is John Wayne, 51 years old, 6 feet 4 inches, 220 pounds of deliberate, unhurried mass. He is holding a coffee cup with a hand, so wide the ceramic looks like a child's toy. His boots are the ones he wears to work, not to impress. His eyes haven't moved in 20 seconds. They don't need to. The other man is 28. Lean as a cable wire, already 6'2", but somehow seeming smaller in this light, in this hallway, standing this close to that stillness. He has been working in Hollywood for 3 years. He has been told he has the face for it, the voice for it, maybe even the patience for it. What nobody has told him, what he is about to learn, is that he has been doing it wrong. He has just asked John Wayne one question. And Wayne hasn't answered yet. The silence has lasted 11 seconds. The young man would remember those 11 seconds for the rest of his 60-year career. Not because of what followed, but because of what that silence was. This is that story. To understand what happened in that hallway, you have to understand the year. You have to understand the town. And you have to understand what it meant, in October of 1958, to be 28 years old in Hollywood with a face that everybody noticed and a career that wasn't yet sure what to do with you. Clint Eastwood was nobody's secret. That's the thing. He wasn't anonymous, wasn't struggling in obscurity, wasn't a stagehand dreaming of the light. By the fall of 1958, he had already shot 2 seasons of Rawhide for CBS, a cattle drive western that would eventually run 8 seasons and define a generation's idea of the working cowboy. His face was on television sets in 40 million American homes every Friday night. His name was in the trades. His agent was fielding calls. And yet, here is what the numbers actually said in 1958. Eastwood had appeared in 9 feature films in 3 years, and in every single one, he had been a supporting player, a utility presence, a man standing to the side of the frame while the real story happened to someone else. Revenge of the Creature. Francis in the Navy. Tarantula. Titles that told you everything about where he stood in the studio hierarchy. He was 28, earning $750 a week on Rawhide, and the longest he'd ever been on screen in a single scene was 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The industry respected him the way it respected a good tool. Fine for what it was, limited by design. His problem wasn't talent. The people who worked with him understood that. His problem was something harder to name, something that showed up in the dailies and in the casting director notes, and in the way audiences could never quite locate him even when they were watching him directly. He was present. He was professional. He hit his marks. He delivered his lines with the correct weight and timing, with the technical competence of a craftsman who had studied his trade honestly. But something was missing. He knew it. That was the thing. He wasn't blind to it. He had watched the same dailies. He had felt it on set, that faint wrongness, like a guitar string tuned almost not quite to the right pitch. He was performing. And the camera, which lies about almost everything, tells the truth about that one thing every single time. The Rawhide producers liked him well enough. Director spaghetti westerns were still 3 years away. The moment that would crack him open, Sergio Leone's telegram, the strange Italian location shoot that would make him the man with no name, was still invisible on his horizon. What he had in October of 1958 was a career with momentum and a craft with a ceiling, and he was clear-eyed enough to feel the ceiling. So when he found himself on the Paramount lot that Thursday afternoon, he'd been called in for a wardrobe fitting for an upcoming episode, and he rounded a corner in the back corridor near stage 12 and came face to face with John Wayne. He made a decision. He stopped. He introduced himself. He said he was a fan, which was true. And then, because he had maybe 30 seconds with the man and he knew it, he asked the question he'd been carrying for 2 years. What he could not have predicted was what the asking would cost him. John Wayne had been on the Paramount lot for reasons that had nothing to do with Eastwood, with Rawhide, or with any production currently in progress. He was there to review locations, scouting photographs for a project still in early development. He had arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon, met with 2 producers for 40 minutes, and was now, at 4:02 p.m., walking toward the east exit the way a man walks when he has somewhere to be and no reason to hurry. He moved. Differently than other men moved. That sounds like a poetic observation. It wasn't. It was a physical fact that everyone who ever stood near him on a lot or on location noted in nearly identical language. It wasn't size alone. Hollywood had plenty of large men. It wasn't bearing, exactly, though his posture was immaculate. It was pace. Wayne moved at a pace that suggested he had already thought through every version of what might happen between here and there, and had decided on his response to each. And now the walking was simply the formality of arriving at an outcome he already held in his hands. There was no wasted motion. There was no performance in his stride. His hands were, by any objective measure, remarkable. The man's hand span measured 9.5 inches, a detail noted by his longtime costume department, who had to special order gloves that fit him. When he held a coffee cup, a rifle, or another man's forearm, the grip looked less like grasping and more like ownership. When he turned the corner near stage 12 and found a tall young man from a Friday night western standing in his path, he stopped with the unhurried precision of a man who stops because he chooses to, not because something blocked him. He looked at Eastwood the way he looked at things he was deciding about, fully, without the social reflex to slide his eyes away. He said, "You're the rawhide kid." Not a question. A file being opened. Eastwood introduced himself, said his name, said it was an honor. He was not wrong that it was an honor. He was also not wrong that Wayne was already reading something in him that went past the introduction, past the courtesy, past the frame of the brief hallway encounter. Wayne had spent 30 years watching men perform in front of cameras and in front of other men, and the thing he had become, the thing the camera had taught him, was a reader of gaps. The gap between what a man presented and what a man was. He heard the gap in Eastwood's voice before the question even came. But here's where it changes. When Eastwood finally asked the question, 2 sentences, simple, direct, the kind of honest professional question a young craftsman asks a master. Wayne set down his coffee cup on a production cart to his left. He didn't answer. He waited 11 seconds. And in those 11 seconds, he taught the first lesson before he'd said a word. The question Eastwood asked was this: what's the one thing I should understand about this, about working in front of a camera, about becoming someone the audience actually believes? It was not a small question dressed in humble clothes. Eastwood wasn't fishing for a compliment or a pat on the shoulder. He was asking a craftsman's question, the kind that takes nerve to ask because it requires the asker to admit, publicly and out loud, that something about his work is insufficient. That something is missing and he knows it. Wayne heard that. He heard the nerve in it, and he heard the honest admission in it. And both of those things earned the young man a real answer rather than a corridor pleasantry. But the answer didn't come the way Eastwood expected. The silence was not an absence. It was a presence. Wayne stood with his weight centered, not leaning, not shifting, not filling the quiet with the low-grade restlessness that most men use to signal that they're still thinking, still engaged, still participating in the social contract of conversation. He simply waited. His eyes held on Eastwood's face with a focus that wasn't aggressive and wasn't warm and wasn't anything that had a common social name. It was the focus of a man reading something that mattered. A second assistant director named Robert Alcott, whose name appears in the Paramount lot attendance logs for that date, and who would later describe the encounter in a 1987 interview with a film historian, had turned the corner behind Wayne and stopped 6 feet back. He understood immediately that he had walked into something that required stillness on his part. He waited too. 7 seconds. 8. 9. The hallway had the low hum of an HVAC unit on its east wall. There was the distant sound of a generator cycling on stage 14. Somewhere, a clapperboard snapped twice in quick succession. 11 seconds after Eastwood finished his question, John Wayne spoke. He said, "You're working too hard." 3 words. Not a lecture. Not a framework or a system or a philosophy laid out in careful sequence. 3 words that landed with the weight of something thrown from altitude. Eastwood didn't understand them immediately. He answered, said something to the effect that he had been working on the craft, that he had been studying, that he had been putting in the time on rawhide, the hours, the technical work. His voice carried the mild defensiveness of a man who had just been told the effort he was proud of was the problem. Wayne listened to all of it without interruption. Then Robert Alcott, from 6 feet back, took a quiet half-step forward as if he might say something. A softening word, a redirect, the small social diplomacy of a man who understood that this moment had an edge on it. He thought better of it and went still again. Wayne had not looked at him. When Eastwood finished, Wayne picked up his coffee cup. "Come here," he said. What happened in the next 9 minutes would shape everything that followed. Not metaphorically. Literally. What Wayne showed Eastwood in a Paramount lot corridor in 9 minutes of afternoon light would echo through 6 decades of cinema, through films that would gross more than $1. $6 billion, through a body of work that remains 50 years on, one of the most studied examples of screen presence in the history of the medium. But in that hallway, it looked like almost nothing. That was the point. Wayne walked Eastwood 15 feet back down the corridor to where a door stood open, one of the small secondary holding rooms that dotted the back corridors of every Paramount building, spare and utilitarian, a folding chair, a wall mirror, a shelf with a few production binders. He didn't explain where he was going. He walked and expected Eastwood to follow, which Eastwood did. In the first second after they stopped inside the room, Wayne said nothing. He stood at the mirror. He looked at himself, not self-consciously, not with vanity, but the way a carpenter looks at a joint to check its alignment. Then he looked at Eastwood in the mirror. "Say something," Wayne said. "Anything. Something you'd say on set." Eastwood delivered a line, something from Rawhide, a piece of trail dialogue, the kind of thing he'd delivered 40 times a week for 2 seasons. He said it correctly. He said it with timing, with the flat Western effect of a working cowboy, with the professional competence that had kept him employed and kept the ratings solid and kept the calls coming. Wayne watched him in the mirror. "Again," he said. But this time, nothing. Eastwood didn't understand the direction. There was no direction in it. Nothing was not an actor's note. He said so. Wayne turned from the mirror and looked at him directly for the first time since they'd entered the room. Here is what he said, and the words are documented in Robert Alcott's 1987 account with a specificity that suggests he was close enough to hear clearly. "The camera doesn't want to see you working. It wants to see you being. Most actors on a set are doing something every moment. Their face is moving. Their hands are moving. They're pushing information at the lens because they're afraid if they go still, the audience loses them. But the audience doesn't lose you when you go still. They find you. The camera finds you. Because still is rare. Still is honest. You only go still when something is real." He paused. "You're pushing. Stop pushing." In the second that followed those last 2 words, something in Eastwood's posture changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of change you'd see on film. It was the small internal shift of a man whose architecture has just been adjusted, who has heard something that rearranged a load-bearing wall. His shoulders dropped approximately 3/4 of an inch. His jaw unclenched by a degree that no tape measure could have captured, but that every human eye in that room registered. The room went silent. Not from sound, but from the sense that something had concluded. Wayne watched it happen. He watched the young man's body make the involuntary concession that the mind hadn't fully caught up to yet. He had seen it before. He had seen it in John Ford's face once, on a location in Monument Valley in 1939, when Ford had made the same observation to him using different language and a louder voice. He had felt it in his own body. He recognized it. He gave it 5 seconds. Then he said, "Now say the line." And Eastwood said the line. The difference was, and this is the thing Robert Alcott spent 3 paragraphs trying to describe in his account, finally settling on language that is frustratingly imprecise because there is no precise language for it. The difference was total. Same words, same voice, same frequency and pitch. But the line arrived differently. It arrived the way a real thing arrives, without announcement, without effort, with the slight roughness of an object that wasn't polished for display. Wayne set down his coffee cup again. "That," he said. "That's what the camera wants." He didn't move to shake Eastwood's hand. He didn't offer congratulation or reassurance. He simply stepped back toward the door, the slight, decisive step of a man who has said what needed to be said, and now the meeting is finished. Not cold finished. There is a difference, and Wayne understood it perfectly. But before he reached the door, he stopped. He turned back. What he said next, the second lesson, the one that came without being asked, Eastwood would not repeat publicly until 2012, in a conversation with film critic Richard Schickel that was recorded but only partially published. He would say it carefully, as if he had carried it for 54 years and was handling it with the same care that one gives to something fragile and irreplaceable. Wayne stood in the doorway with the afternoon light behind him, the kind of backlit framing that any director would have killed for, and he looked at Eastwood for a long moment with the same unsentimental appraisal he'd been applying since the hallway. Then he said, The mistake most of them make is thinking the audience wants to see a character. They don't. They want to see a man. Give them the man, and the character takes care of itself. He picked up his coffee cup from the shelf. A character is a costume. A man is a fact. You can feel the difference through a screen at 30 feet. The audience can't always name what they feel, but they feel it every time. Eastwood, who was, by his own later admission, not a man who was easily stopped cold, found himself with no response. Not because the words were confusing, because they were the exact reverse of everything he had been taught, everything he had practiced, everything he had understood about the act of creating a screen performance. He had spent 3 years learning to build characters. Backstory, motivation, internal logic, the careful architecture of a fictional person assembled from research and technique. Wayne had just told him that all of it was the problem. Not useless. The problem. What he meant, what Eastwood spent the next decade learning to inhabit, was this: the camera's fundamental operation is the detection of truth. It is, at its core, a truth-sensing instrument. And the most sophisticated, technically accomplished performance in the world registers to the camera as what it is: a performance. A construction. A man doing something, rather than a man being something. The audience doesn't want to watch someone be good at acting. They want to watch a man, a real, specific, irreducible human fact, encounter something that matters to him and respond from his actual nature. Eastwood was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "How do you know when you're doing it right?" Wayne almost smiled. It arrived at the corner of his mouth, a small eruption of warmth that didn't make it all the way to his eyes before it settled. "You stop asking that question," he said. He walked out. Alcott, still in the corridor, stepped aside. Wayne acknowledged him with a nod. The slight downward tilt of a man who sees you, categorizes you as not a threat, and moves on. Then he turned the corner and was gone, and the sound of his boots on the concrete diminished at the same steady pace with which he had arrived. Eastwood stood at the door of the small room for perhaps 30 seconds. He was holding nothing, leaning on nothing, looking at no particular point on the opposite wall. He was being still. Alcott would later write that it was the first time, in 3 years of working on the Paramount lot, that he had watched a man learn something in real time. Not understand it intellectually, but learn it, the way a body learns the distribution of weight when you finally stand a certain way correctly. The lesson had gone somewhere deeper than the mind. 42 years in the industry. 9 major studio films completed before this hallway. And in 9 minutes, on a Thursday afternoon, with a coffee cup as the only prop, John Wayne had handed Eastwood the key to everything that followed. He didn't receive a credit for it. He didn't want one. Years later, 30 years later, to be precise, Clint Eastwood was directing Unforgiven. It was 1991. He was 61 years old. He had made 32 films as an actor and 12 as a director, and Unforgiven would win him his first Academy Award, Best Picture and Best Director both, and would be selected for preservation in the National Film Registry as a work of cultural, historical, and aesthetic significance. In the production notes from the Unforgiven set, his longtime cinematographer Jack N. Green describes Eastwood's direction to his cast with a phrase that appears almost verbatim across 6 separate actor interviews from that period. He kept saying, "Don't do anything. Know who your character is, then stop performing him. Just be there. The camera will find you." Morgan Freeman, who appeared in Unforgiven as Ned Logan, said in a 2002 interview, "Clint told me once that the best thing you can do for a scene is trust that the camera is smarter than you are. Get out of its way. Be the truth of the thing, and let the lens do the work." Gene Hackman, who won his second Academy Award for his performance as the villain Little Bill Daggett in Unforgiven, described a single directorial note from Eastwood during production. "He said something to me that sounded simple and wasn't. He said, 'Don't act the fear. Have the fear. Then let it out at whatever size it actually is.' I still think about that every time I'm on set. These were not original ideas. They were a 33-year-old inheritance. They had arrived in a Paramount lot corridor on a Thursday afternoon in October 1958. They had passed from a man who understood the camera at its deepest level to a young man willing to be still long enough to receive them. And they had traveled forward through 3 decades of work and into the performances of actors who never knew their source. That is what a real lesson does. It doesn't stay where it lands. It replicates, migrates, propagates through the hands of the people it changed and into the hands of the people those people changed. John Wayne never stepped behind a camera as a director. He never wrote a textbook on screen presence, or gave a master class, or accepted an honorary professorship from a film school. He stood in a corridor with a coffee cup and told a 28-year-old to stop working so hard. And the ripple from that stillness is still moving. Return for a moment to that hallway. Two men, 8 feet apart. The afternoon light. The 11-second silence before the answer arrived. What Eastwood felt in those 11 seconds, the thing he would describe decades later as a kind of pressure, a weight of being genuinely read by someone who did it without effort or self-consciousness, was the lesson before the lesson. It was Wayne demonstrating the principle before naming it. The stillness wasn't a pause. It was the argument. It was Wayne being, rather than doing, in front of a man who had spent 3 years confusing the two. He never had to say, "This is what I mean." He showed him. That's not technique. That's philosophy rendered physical. One question. One silence. One corridor that history almost walked past without stopping. And somewhere in a film you've seen 100 times, in a frame you've paused and pointed at without knowing why it landed, the ghost of that Thursday afternoon is still working. Still patient, doing nothing at all. But there was one moment in John Wayne's career that he never discussed in any interview, never referenced in any of his private correspondence that has since been published, and never explained to anyone on any set. A moment involving a much bigger name than Eastwood, a much higher stakes confrontation, and a decision that, if the accounts are accurate, changed the direction of American cinema in a way that no one has ever fully mapped. And the reason he went silent about it, the reason that story stayed locked for 50 years, that's a story for another time.